Have you ever wondered what truly hides in the shadows of a modern city? What if the monsters you thought were myths weren't just real but thriving among us right now? This isn't the story of romantic, brooding vampires. This is the story of something far darker. The first time Jake saw one of them, he thought it was a mugging. It was late, well past midnight, and the city was draped in its usual mix of neon light and grime. Jake was a food delivery driver, spending his nights weaving through alleys and side streets to make ends meet. That night, his route took him through an unfamiliar part of town, an industrial area with warehouses and almost no foot traffic. As he turned a corner, he saw a man hunched over another person. For a second, Jake thought the guy was helping someone who had fallen. But then he saw the blood. It wasn't a lot, just a glint under the flickering streetlight, but it was enough to make Jake freeze. The hunched figure looked up, and that's when Jake noticed the eyes. They weren't human. They gleamed in the dark like a predator's, reflecting the light in a way that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Jake did what any sane person would do. He bolted. The next day, he tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was a junkie. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. He told himself the city was full of weird things, and not all of them needed an explanation. But then it happened again. This time, Jake wasn't working. He was at a bar with some friends, trying to unwind. The place was packed, the air thick with the smell of beer and sweat. As Jake nursed his drink, he noticed a woman at the edge of the room. She didn't look like she belonged there. Her clothes were too clean, her skin too pale. She was beautiful, in an eerie, almost doll-like way. But there was something wrong with her. She wasn't drinking. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was just staring at him. Jake tried to ignore it, but her gaze was unrelenting. He finally worked up the courage to confront her, but when he got close, she was gone. One moment, she was there. The next, she wasn't. Over the next week, Jake started noticing things he couldn't explain. People he didn't recognize seemed to know him. He'd catch glimpses of faces in mirrors or windows, only for them to disappear when he turned around. And then there were the nightmares. In his dreams, he was running through the city, but it wasn't the city he knew. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned, and always he could hear footsteps behind him, getting closer and closer. One night, he woke up to find his bedroom window open. He was sure he had locked it before going to bed. Jake tried to tell himself he was just paranoid, but deep down, he knew better. Something was happening to him, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. He started doing research, spending hours on the internet looking for anything that could explain what he was experiencing. That's when he stumbled across a forum thread titled, "The Real Vampires of the Modern World." Most of the posts were nonsense, people claiming they were vampires or that they'd been bitten by one. But one comment stood out. They don't live in castles. They don't turn into bats, but they're real. And if they've noticed you, it's already too late. The comment was from someone with the username Shadowed Truth. Jake sent them a message, not expecting a reply. To his surprise, they responded almost immediately. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Jake hesitated before typing back, "I think so. What do I do?" Shadowed Truth's reply was chilling, "Run." But running wasn't an option. Not anymore. That night, Jake's apartment was broken into. At least, that's what it looked like at first. The lock was busted, his belongings scattered. But nothing was stolen. Instead, there was a message scrawled on his living room wall in something dark and sticky. "We see you." Jake packed a bag and left. He didn't know where to go, so he wandered the city, sticking to crowded places. But even in the busiest streets, he felt alone. Every time he stopped, he saw them, faces in the crowd that didn't belong, eyes that gleamed in the dark. Eventually, he found himself at an all-night diner, sitting in the corner booth with a cup of coffee he didn't touch. That's where she found him. The woman from the bar. She slid into the seat across from him, her movements unnaturally smooth. Up close, her skin looked almost translucent, like it was stretched too thin over her bones. "You can't run," she said, her voice soft but cold. "We always find you." "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "You've been chosen." Jake learned the truth that night. The vampires weren't like the ones in stories. They didn't live in secluded mansions or ancient crypts. They lived among humans, hiding in plain sight. They fed not just on blood, but on fear, on the thrill of the hunt. And once they marked someone, they wouldn't stop until they claimed them. "You can join us," the woman said, "or you can die." Jake didn't answer. He just ran. The rest of the night was a blur. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. But no matter how far he ran, they were always there, waiting around the next corner, watching from the shadows. By the time the sun rose, Jake was exhausted. He collapsed in an alley, his body trembling with fear and fatigue. He thought it was over. But then a hand reached out to him. It wasn't one of them. It was a man, older, with a scar running down the side of his face. "Come with me if you want to live," the man said. Jake didn't have the strength to argue. The man's name was Marcus, and he was part of a small group of survivors who had managed to evade the vampires. They called themselves the Veil. Marcus explained that the vampires were more organized than anyone realized. They had their own hierarchy, their own rules. And they didn't just kill for food. They recruited. "They see something in you," Marcus said, "something they want." Jake didn't know what that was, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to survive. The Veil taught him how to fight back. Garlic and crosses were useless, but fire worked. So did sunlight, if you could lure them into it. But the most important thing was to never ever let them corner you. Jake learned quickly, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The vampires were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. The final confrontation came sooner than he expected. Jake and Marcus were holed up in an abandoned building when the vampires found them. They came in force, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. Jake fought with everything he had, using the skills Marcus had taught him. But it wasn't enough. One by one, the others fell. In the end, it was just Jake and the woman from the bar. "You can't win," she said, her voice like a blade. "This is your destiny." But Jake refused to give in. He grabbed a makeshift torch, lighting it with a trembling hand. "This isn't my destiny," he said, and with that, he plunged the torch into her chest. The vampires fled after that, but Jake knew they'd be back. He wasn't safe. He might never be safe. But for now, he was alive. And that was enough. Hit subscribe for more. This is just beginning.